start practicing with a knife? How old were you?
I grew up in South Africa, which is has a reputation for being a very violent country. So I grew up in a very violent neighborhood, and the knife is it's a very common thing that you see where I grew up. So it's something that you learn as a child, 5, 6 years old. It's something you see and you play with. So children don't learn it formally; they learn it through playing, and they see other people do it. So it's something that's ingrained into you from childhood, from early childhood. I'd say I got seriously interested in it at around the age of 16. I was robbed twice. I had my money stolen one time. I had my shoes stolen another time. I was very, very lucky. And then at 19, I was attacked in a train. I was very, very fortunate not to be hurt. I was with my girlfriend at the time, and the fact that I was helpless made me really want to understand how this worked, how knives worked, and how criminals used them.
Why exactly did you pick a knife?
My interest wasn't for me to really learn about how to use knives. My interest, because of the problem of knife crime back home in South Africa, was to learn how criminals used them so that I wasn't a victim of them. So if you want to deal with the problem, you first have to understand the problem. So I had to study criminals, and the criminals back home in South Africa typically use this particular weapon, which is the okapi, which is a very blunt, very cheap knife. It's about $2.
Would you mind telling us how long have you been teaching this martial?
I'd say since about roughly 1999, the year 2000. So in a formal capacity, I'd say about 16 years now. 1999, 2000, so approximately 16 years now.
Would you mind telling about your personal martial arts system? What is the difference of it from the other systems?
Most martial arts systems are westernized, so there's a few differences I think I could highlight. From a Western perspective, a lot of that is derived from fencing. We have a sword. So typically in a Western perspective, you stand behind the weapon. So the weapon protects you and the enemy is on the other side in front. If you look at the way African people use a knife, the knife is hidden at the back. So what happens is that when you face the guy, your intention, your desire to hurt them leads. So when the criminal comes at you, the weapon is hidden, and the weapon is, when it's out, it is behind him. So he protects the weapon. It's a very different attitude towards the weapon being here versus the weapon being hidden and then behind you, and I go and hurt you. We focus on balance. African systems, if you look at them, Africans move in ways, from a Western point of view, we work in very neat ways. Africans move in very awkward ways, very tight ways, which are not Western. So it took me a while to understand the difference between the way Westerners move and think and the way Africans move and think when they commit violence. So movements that we don't consider to be, when we're Westerners, we expect to see neat movement. So when we see black people move in a violent way, we often don't recognize it as actual fighting moves because they have a completely different conception. So those are two simple differences. The knife is often used as a distraction. It's not necessarily the primary weapon. So someone will do this, and the knife will disappear, and then they'll hit you in the face with a fist. But the weapon was used purely as a distraction. I'll give you one example, if I can show you. If you can. From a Western point of view, you're familiar with using this, which is very, very typical. But if you look at the way black people use a knife, the wrist is a lot more flexible. And when you do things like this frees up the other hand. So you'll be kicking, elbowing, headbutting. But I'll give you an example also. Here I'm going to be standing. If this was someone a target, I'm attacking. So the attack comes in here, which, because of the way that African systems are very deceptive, they lie to you, they deceive you. If I attack here, I'm standing here. So I'll be attacking here. And this goes behind the clavicle and in. So there's a lot of deception. From a criminal point of view, there's a lot of deception. It's not fencing, it's deceiving.
Would you mind telling if there is a certain logical model or logic in your system?
Yes. Now, because what I learned is based on criminal behavior from Africans, it's based on an African model of movement and combat. But in South Africa, there were three influences that essentially changed the way black people in South Africa fought with knives. The Zulu stick fighting, Shaka Zulu had the stick and the spear fighting. Boxing, which was introduced about a century ago, and also silat. When the Dutch came to South Africa, they brought the Malaysian, Indonesian slaves. Mm-hmm. These three things combined, so you have a system that is derived from very effective stick fighting and spear fighting, boxing, and silat. I've adapted that since then, but originally that is what it is. Those three combined historically to form the South African system of knife. 20 years ago, when I started learning this, I copied it. The movements are very big and very African. They're very big movements. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to demonstrate the stick fighting and spear fighting aspect of it when you see it. Mm-hmm. But I have since adapted it because I've made it a lot smaller, a lot stealthier. A lot of the strikes are hidden. Think of a system made up of sucker punches, ambushes. Okay. A system made specifically out of ambushes and sucker punches.
Would you mind telling about this Malaysian silat? What is it?
I am no expert on silat, but silat, Malaysians and Indonesians, especially Indonesians, tend to be smaller people, smaller Asian people. So they use a lot of evasion and close, tight movements because they don't have the size, so they have to focus on technique. From an African point of view, because they're using the stick and the cultural attitude, it's very big movements, but silat can be very tiny, very sneaky. It sticks to people and wraps around people. So these are the elements that we discovered and that I've used to create what I do today.
In your opinion, how important is martial arts system of a knife on the world scale?
In certain parts of the world, knives are not allowed, they're not legal, so it is not necessarily easy for people to learn. But criminals use them, and if you look at what is happening in certain countries around the world, knife attacks are becoming more and more common, especially when guns are outlawed. So it's important, if not to learn how to use them, to at least learn how to understand how criminals use them and how to defend against them.
Do you think a person has to have a certain psychological preparation in order to start practicing with a knife?
I personally, many people that start with knives start because they fear something. They fear being stabbed. They don't want to hurt people, but they don't want to be hurt. They want to protect themselves and their families. So I think it's a matter of just facing up to reality that more and more knife attacks are occurring, and we need to be prepared. I personally see knives as a thug's weapon, so I don't like them, but I also don't want to be a victim. This is true for, I think, for most people.
In your opinion, why are there so many people that desire to teach knife fighting?
I have a different... Martial arts are about, to some degree, fantasy and about ego. And this may be seen as a way of testing your manhood or your readiness for danger. Sometimes also knives are very easy to get hold of. So that makes it easy to start learning with them. But I think it will become more necessary as more knife crimes occur.
Can you tell us about a methodology according to which a person can be prepared to master this knife fighting?
I teach people that just like when you pull out a gun, that is a lethal situation and you have to be legally ready to use it. There must be a reason. The very same counts for a knife. You don't pull one of these out unless you are prepared to do harm or you know that you are in severe risk. So that aspect has to be there. You don't casually pull out a knife. That's a murder weapon. I teach people that knives are about murder because where I come from, knives are a murder weapon. So it's not something you do casually. These are killing tools. So one of the first things I need to teach people is show them what criminals do so they understand the violence they will receive. And two, teach them aggression and the willingness to fight against that violence coming up.
So when a person, for example, a student comes to you and says, oh, please teach me a knife fighting, what is the first step that you go with him?
I have to teach them what will happen to them, how knife attacks happen.
Yeah.
You know, so you will teach how they'll be approached, how the guy will stand, where is the knife? Is it under his shirt, in his pocket, in his front pocket? So these are things he has to understand about how he will be attacked, and I have to do examples of attacks to learn what will happen and how they are used, so he understands that. When I do a seminar these days, the knife is maybe only 15% used 15% of the time. The rest of the time is to teach what an ambush looks like, how a sudden close attack looks. So we have to understand how do criminals attack in your environment, what kind of knives are used, and then I teach about how to deal with an ambush, how to understand how they will deceive you, how they will lead your attention away so you don't see them when they're close. So the idea of perception and deception, how they deceive and how you perceive, those are very critical things, and how to deal with that sudden ambush. Those are the most important things for me. You have to survive that first half second.
Is there any difference in working with different types of knives? For example, with dagger, with navaja, stiletto, African knife?
Yes, different weapons change your options and your movement. They change where you carry them, how you carry them, and how you move with them. My focus is generally on this knife is blunt. Mm-hmm. So you cannot, it's a real knife, but notice it's not cutting me. Mm-hmm. You can't use this, you're not going to, it's blunt. Mm-hmm. But, so the important piece of this knife is this tip. Mm-hmm. They stab. They don't cut where I come from. There's no cutting. There is only stabbing. So that's something I focus on, because most people die from stabs. They don't die from cuts. You can be cut many times and not die, but one stab can kill you. So I focus on the idea of dealing with this knife before it can be used.
There are different types of martial arts like Italian, Filipino, African, and so forth. So which martial arts systems do deserve attention?
I think cultures that have violence today have a lot to tell us about how criminals are behaving. If you look at some older systems used 1,000 years ago, they're not very practical to me. I enjoy them. I love old martial arts and Tai Chi, but I'm concerned about how criminals behave today. My focus originally was South Africa. Now, South Africa has half the population of the Philippines, where most blade systems come from today, the Filipino martial arts, but we have 8 times their murder rate, and South Africa has 10 times their violent crime rate. South Africa has much more knife crime than the Philippines does. We have 6 to 10 times more knife crime than they do. We're a real knife culture. So my focus is studying my culture. Very few people have studied criminals. So, and these are the real users of knives as weapons, and we can learn from them.
Please share the history of how the African knife system actually developed.
South Africa has, it's just, unfortunately, we have a criminal subculture. It's black people have a criminal subculture back home. There is no formal system. Every criminal has 2 or 3 things that he does that work for him. So myself and a friend at the time, we spent almost 10 years gathering all this information, talking to many different criminals, finding contacts. And so if you have 10 criminals, they will each have 3 moves, that's 30 moves. We eventually learned what these were so that one guy can have all of these movements. And that's what we did. We formalized the fragmented criminal methodologies, and then we made it a little more sophisticated.
Are there any like traditions in African martial arts system, like a traditional system?
In South Africa, we have 20 different languages because there's so many different cultures that are mixed, from the British, French, the Germans, the Dutch, and so on, and different black cultures. The Zulu and the Xhosa have a fighting tradition. You'd be familiar with it from Shaka Zulu. Stick fighting and spear fighting, with the shield and the stick, or the shield and the spear. So those are the tribal black people that have a system. The other black people and the other people in the country don't have any fighting traditions like that.
Can you please share about the effective sides of your martial arts system that you have developed?
People are familiar with Western movement and Asian movement. No one is as yet familiar with true African movement, which is very different. When you see Western people walk, they walk in one way. When you see black people walk, they bounce and they move in weird ways, right? This changes the movement entirely. So the timing, the rhythm, the distances, the angles all change. So when I do things, when I train with people, I can do things they've never seen and they do not expect. And so my movements are not familiar to them. When they think that I'm falling, I'm attacking. When they think that I'm just moving away, I'm hitting. So what they think they see and what happens are different. I'm constantly cheating. I'm constantly deceiving. So there's this unknown element that allows me to win.
The way that your feet move, is this important?
Yes and no. When you teach a bird to fly, you just confuse it, because birds know how to fly. Mm-hmm. So if you put a bird in a classroom, he'll just make it very, very confused and it won't be able to fly. Mm-hmm. So the feet know where to go. If you just allow the instinct and the subconscious, if you use it correctly, you will move your feet to the right place to be in position or to be balanced. So I teach people to not think about their feet at all. So I find that it overcomplicates things. Mm-hmm. And if you move out of instinct, and I can teach people to do that, and the less you think, the more you simply operate out of your subconscious, let's say, the quicker and the less complicated your moves are. We move, when you think of, I've studied movement and a lot of neuropsychology around movement. When you decide to walk to the kitchen, you don't think I have to move my toes, then I must move my ankle, I must put my foot like this. You don't think, you just think you have an intention. I want to go from here to there, and your body takes you, because physiologically we move patterns. The body and the brain move patterns. We don't move parts. Mm-hmm. So I don't teach parts, I teach patterns, whole patterns of movement. So you fire the intention and the body follows. The body slaves itself to your intention.
Okay, would you mind if we imagine a certain situation and then discuss it? So let's think that it is night outside,
улица,
and there's a street, and you are walking by with your girlfriend. And suddenly you see that 2 people are suddenly coming, one in front and one in the back, with knives. And you don't have time to think. You don't have an advantage to run away. You cannot run away. What would you do?
How close are they?
One in the back, he even, is holding the knife in your back, to your back.
A situation like that, usually, obviously your perception, your understanding of the environment, you must have failed in your observations not to see them and to allow them that close. The less dangerous a weapon is, the more likely someone is to use it. So there's high risk there. But the first thing that failed is your perception, mm-hmm. right? Why were you in that place in the first place? How you didn't see them coming, how you didn't move out of the way. When you cannot get out of the way, you have to commit to your defense. This isn't the decision you suddenly have to make. You should have made that decision a long time ago. That you understand the risks and you are going to fight. Moving first will always give you an advantage. You may not have time to get a weapon, so you have to attack first and fast. I would take out the guy closest to me before he is ready, and I would, without hesitation, move on the second guy, because this is probably something they do not expect. So I teach people these scenarios, and I teach them how to move in ways that create confusion, that create doubt. Criminals do this, and they have very effective tools. I teach those very same tools, and I teach people how to turn the tables and ambush the ambusher. But surprise will always defeat the one who moves first. Has the element of surprise and advantage.
So imagine that it's winter and there's snow till your knees. There's a lot of snow. So you are walking by and you hear some steps behind you, let's say like in 5 meters. So yeah, of course in the winter you will be wearing some winter clothes, the coat and stuff. And so suddenly you hear that a person starts, he gets really fast, he runs towards you. You don't know he has a weapon, like if he has a knife or not.
One of the things that I teach people is how to ambush other people. Because most of the time people who are attacked with knives are unarmed. The victim is unarmed, he has no weapons. And often if you take the time to get to your weapon, you will be hurt or killed. So the point is to learn how to operate out of uncertainty. You don't know what's going on. So you have to deal with uncertainty and then gain advantage. Now, the fact is that certain things can gain from advantage. Rough movements will always defeat smooth movements. So when someone moves rough, it'll always beat movements that are smooth. It'll disrupt those. We always perceive rough movements as confusing, and we need to take a moment to think and process and then decide our response. This creates a small gap that we can use. So we want to create randomness. This person attacks us by surprise. So we need to surprise them by introducing randomness, by introducing uncertainty and confusion for them. So we buy a moment in his psychology, in his timing, and we get into that gap and we open it. His instinct to survive is also trying to protect him. Most of us will defend. I teach people to attack, to go straight onto the assault, not to hesitate, because when his instinct sees that he is under threat, potentially, it causes him to reevaluate. While he starts to reevaluate, see, he's attacking, we're thinking. But if we attack, he now needs to think and deal with new information. We use that moment while he's stopping to think, to attack, and then to build advantage. So, to try to simplify, so I don't talk too much, movement is meaning. And when someone comes at us, we have to decode the meaning of the movement and then respond. But if we can take away the decision, we can just respond, because you understand your body instinctively through training reacts to the movement. He then has to then decode the movement for himself and decide its meaning as well. Now, if you think, very simple example, when you're angry, you move in angry ways. When you're happy, you move in happy ways. When you're sad, you move in sad ways. Different parts of the brain move in different ways. Aggression moves differently to happiness. When you're giving a lecture, you move in controlled ways, right? So if you can go from the front of your brain and step into the back of your brain, the cerebellum specifically, you can operate, if you can flip that switch, the aggressive movement that you need will come into play, and because it's information he has to process. So there's a psychological component that we are triggering. It's part of what's called the OODA loop. I'll stop there. So if you can get away, get away, run. If you cannot, then you have no choice. Attack everything you have, and I teach people to flip that switch so that they operate. When we think, right, when we use our forebrains to think, our movements are limited to a speed of about 1/4 of a second to 1/5 of a second. When we start to operate out of our the rear part of our brain, our movement speed starts to increase to about 1/10 of a second.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what we're taught is front brain stuff. Think about this. These movements are fine if you're operating out of this brain, but why is it in a fight all those neat movements go away and all you see are these rough movements? Because you're not using this brain, you're using this part of your brain. And the movement changes. So I teach people to fight out of this part of the brain and use those movements.
Lloyd, can you please tell us, so you say that you teach people to use this back side of the brain, not the front one, right? Why would that give an advantage over the opponent?
Speed. You see, if you look at your neocortex, the front of your brain, it is designed for tasks that don't move faster than 1/4 of a second. Right? So if you see something that lasts 1/4 of a second approximately, your front brain can cope with things happening at that speed. It's designed for that. Right? And so 1/4 of a second or longer. But a punch takes much less than 1/4 of a second. So the front brain is not designed to deal with that speed. This part of your brain is designed to deal with that. So if you are working out of this part of your brain and he's working out of the back of his brain, he's moving 2.5 times faster than you are, at least.
Okay.
So if you can hand over your perception, and well, if you can take in the scene and then allow the back of your brain to fight, it is designed to fight, it is designed to respond at very high speed. It is not just reflexes, it is trained responses based on experience and based on calculation. That part of the brain can perceive at levels much, much faster, at least 24 times faster than the forebrain.
How would you teach?
This is 5 years of research that I've done. Let me mention one thing. Often people say, I blanked out, I went black, I did something, I can't remember, but I won, and the guy was lying there, or something happened and something ran in front of the car and I swerved and I don't know how I did it, but I survived. And then they come back and they go, I don't know what happened, right? You familiar with this? This happens a lot.
Yes.
Now the front part of our brain works with words and, movies, images, sequences. The back of our brain doesn't have words, it cannot explain, but it is much, much faster. We have two kinds of thinking: rational, logical, sequential thinking, and instant responses. So when you educate the instant response with experience, it just happens. It doesn't think, it just responds. Now, this part of the brain can operate at far greater speeds. Now, because there's no words there, because it doesn't do sequences and it only operates in now, the forebrain sees a threat and hands over to the rear part of the brain, the cerebellum. The cerebellum acts, and it has no words, it has no memory, it has no pictures, it has no movies. When it's done, it hands over to the front of the brain and it says, have a look and tell me if we are done here. And all that the front brain remembers is fragmented images and fragmented emotion, because the back brain doesn't have words to describe what it did. It's simply just, because it's so fast, the front brain has no idea what happened. It just sees black because it happened so fast that it couldn't keep up. And two, the back brain has no way of communicating to the front brain what it did. We have two brains, right? Psychologists call them System 1 and System 2. System 2 is rational thinking, slow learning, experience, practice. System 1 is instant thinking. You touch a hot stove, you take your hand off. That's System 1. System 2 is, what do you think is the best way to build this house that I want? And then you have to think slowly. In a fight, that's too slow. So you need to operate out of System 1, so you must educate it using System 2. And eventually, System 1 the very rapid thinking brain becomes faster and faster and more efficient. You go from struggling to learn to you do it without thinking, second nature. So your brain builds up a database called a database of associative coherence. It operates many, many times faster than your forebrain is capable of doing. So the front brain can operate is many times slower than, so you have this database of experience called a database of associative coherence. It associates things and then makes instant decisions. To communicate with the back of your brain, you don't use words. It doesn't know language. It knows posture, movement, and emotion. So to trigger this part of your brain, you have to adopt posture, attitude, and movement. So the final thing, in the system that I've developed, there are only 3 techniques. I only teach people 3 basic techniques as beginners to learn with. Only 3. I don't have 50 or 100 or just 3. A simple technique, a more advanced, it's like just to give them an idea to build with. And there are about 7 movements that people learn. Only about 7 very basic movements. Everything we do, everything I teach a 2-day seminar, 16 hours, using just these few movements. And people spontaneously, creatively just make up techniques that respond without thinking to attacks and to situations that develop. They simply become creative in the moment. They don't have to think. They just respond. Okay, so African movement, to go back to that, culturally is very different to Western movement. Think waltz versus salsa. You don't think. They're very, very different.
Okay.
So, and black people, when they fight, think out of a totally different part of their brain than do white people. There's difference. I studied this now. I grew up in a culture where I learned both, but I've studied what black people do to learn from what they do so well that we haven't yet examined. And so this is what I've been working with the last 5 years now. I've been developing and refining this material. When you ask a criminal, how are you going to hurt this guy? He says, man, I'm just going to go there and hurt him. He doesn't know what he's going to do. They go and do it, you know? So they see a moment, they see a gap, and they take it. And once people can see these moments, you then teach them how to get better at using these moments and teach them how to get more skilled once they create that zone of safety and once they see an attack that they can make.
You mean the black people act this way?
All criminals.
All criminals. Oh.
All violent people.
Okay.
All violent people. If you ask a guy in prison, you know, what are you going to do? He says, I'm going to go there, I'm going to hurt him. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He's going to see what occurs in that moment, and then he will do something. He doesn't know what. So I'm teaching people in that moment, you don't know what you will do, but something will happen. The correct thing will happen. But you have to trust it. And I teach people to go into that moment, and they will find a gap, and they will suddenly something will happen, and they'll go, I don't know what I did, but I won.
Is there any future perspective, the futureness for a knife in 21st century? Is it going to leave?
If we look at some of the things that are happening in the world today, I mean, just recently now again in France, there are more and more knife attacks in the world. In the UK, they banned guns. The knife attacks are 4 times higher than the gun attacks in America. In Australia, they banned guns, and they have incredibly high numbers of knife attacks, and they have more gun attacks than they've ever had in their history. If we look at what's happening with certain groups who are attacking people with knives now, there is a lot more knife violence. So yes, we have to, even if we don't want to hurt people with knives, we have to learn to protect ourselves from people with knives. There's radicalization out there, people are attacking with knives, and knives are easy to get. In fact, anything could work. I teach people to use pencils or forks or anything. You don't need a knife per se. Also, most of my training, 85% of my training, is really teaching people how they will be stabbed and how to move so that they do not get stabbed. How to create a gap so they can get to their own weapon. 15% maybe of my training is actually how to stab someone, how to, if need be, kill someone. But that is like 15%. Most of it is how to move so that you do not get hurt yourself and that you can access your weapon. Right? So that is the more important focus. don't get hurt by that ambush, and then once you have position, then you can retaliate.
Are there any like limitations in your system? Does it matter which kind of weapon do you use? Navaja, dagger,
Обычный нож.
or is there like simple knife?
Generally, the knife tends to be short, of this length, about 9 inches or less. Yes, it'll work with a bigger weapon, and a sharper knife is just going to be more deadly. It really doesn't matter what you use. Mostly, I teach movement. I teach people about movement and psychological and emotional states and how this affects movement, how to create deception, how to affect emotion, how to create emotion, how to create illusions of movement, right? So this is what I mostly teach, but yes, the more dangerous the knife, the better the quality of the knife, the more dangerous what you do will become. But it really doesn't matter what you use. I don't particularly care.
Да.